Perfect. So, welcome to all. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm here to welcome you to this panel for the release of the social movements and philanthropy publication. I am from Rede Comuá, and we mobilize resources from different sources to support different collectives and movements of social society in their struggle for environmental justice, human rights, and the strengthening of communities. Today, we have simultaneous interpreting at our webinar, and one of the panelists will be speaking English, and you can choose the language that you would like to listen to using the globe on Zoom.
We also have English translation, simultaneous translation available. Just click on the globe that you find on the bottom of your screen and choose the interpretation channel, the English interpretation channel.
Questions and answers will be, or actually, sorry, the Q&A will be done through the Q&A function here on Zoom, and we will choose the questions that will be answered in the final 30 minutes of our time together. So I am very happy to start this event, to release this survey, Social Movements and Philanthropy here in Brazil. And I would like to first start by providing a few opening words. The social movements are related to acknowledging rights, and they are very important players in the consolidation and defense of democracy. And currently, in this scenario where the far right is threatening democracy, strengthening our fight for rights is urgent because of the alarming uh, numbers related to the murder of women, Black people, and also trans individuals. We see this as a threat to our democracy, and we are facing this challenge with limited resources, and the organizations still have to defend themselves because of this situation. But even though this is a life-threatening situation, social movements are extremely important to counteract all of these issues. The first role that it has was in the COVID-19 pandemic, where these movements were on the front lines in facing the crisis, mobilizing population, and allowing marginalized peoples to access prevention and health actions. And there were surveys that showed how much the marginalized populations were affected by COVID-19. We also have the initiative related to the bill that is labeled the rapist bill. And it is in this context that our survey was carried out. We want to defend the role and analyze the role of philanthropy in supporting social movements here in Brazil. This publication seeks to encourage the actions in this sector and create a relationship between different players of national philanthropy. We hope to create a discussion on how philanthropy can work more strategically and committed to social transformation that these movements are carrying out. This week, there was the release of another survey that talks about the professionalization of the third sector and other aspects as a disadvantage for social movements. And I believe that this shows something about the role of philanthropy for social movements. For us, this goes beyond how we can make donations to these groups more available or just about accountability, but this is about having donations that are actually committed to the project of a country that will promote and defend the rights that were granted by the historical fight of different activists here in Brazil. In a moment where our democracy has been threatened, it is fundamental that we discuss these players that are so important for democracy and for human rights. And I would like to thank all of you who were a part of this research. If you were interviewed in the focal groups, the Comuá team, and I would like to thank all of the members of the Comuá team as well. And of course, our funding partners that made this process possible.
Also, we would like to share with you our findings and reflections. I would like to invite Gelson Henrique to join us. He's a sociologist. He holds an MA in social science, and he has been acknowledged as one of the 10 young people who make the difference in Brazil. And I would also like to say that he's the father of Anima, lovely baby girl, and it's great to have you with us today. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for introducing me. I'm Henrique, a sociologist and also representative of PIPA. And I've been doing research for over a decade, and I'm also the father of Amina, a 4-month-old baby. Oh, I'm sharing the screen. So let me tell you a bit about the research. So it's an initiative connected to philanthropy for social justice and peace. And you can read the QR codes, and then you're going to have access to the research focused in Africa and the other QR code for the research focused in Asia. And you're going to see how those findings, the findings of the research, connect to each other. Gelson, would you like to approach the methodology? Good morning, guys. Welcome all. I would like to thank all of you and also thank Jonathas. Thank you for joining us and for helping us put together this research. It's important for us to thank Rede Comuá for the opportunity of providing this consultancy work. And here I'm playing the role of a research consultant, and I'm going to detail our methodology. The more we study about philanthropy, the better we understand the complexities, and we conduct better analysis, better plural analysis, so that we can cater to the needs of people. And we need to take into account Black youth so that their voices are heard. And we believe that this sector is really positive for us to build a structural change. Thank you so much, Rede Comuá, for trusting my skills and so that I would contribute to this research. When we consider the methodology, we did literary review focused on social movements, at national and international levels. And we were analyzing how philanthropy operated in the world and also in Brazil, and how it fostered democracy. And the most important thing that we focused was financing for social movements. And we are talking about organizations that keep the work we do running. And one of the things that we focused on was the pandemic. And during the pandemic in Brazil, social movements, they played a very important role. And they shaped Brazil in 2024. After we did this part, we started conducting interviews with people, and we talked to other partners in different parts of of our segment of social movements in Brazil. So for us to analyze philanthropy in Brazil, we had to analyze what it meant historically to have access to philanthropy in Brazil. And then we reflected upon what we could do and how to actually conduct financing for a social movement. And later on, we selected some different focal groups that cater to the needs of different social movements. And we analyzed groups that had limited access to funds. We also connected with groups from abroad. It's important that we define what social movement means. But in our study, we consider that social movements, they are meant so that collective actions that are not regulated by the mainstream power. Basically, social movements, they don't comply with the government at large. We really focused on the fact that social movements are linked to political struggle. And why is it important to provide support to social movements? When we consider the current political scenario, historically, social movements are key for changing society, regardless if social movements are registered or not. When we consider affirmative actions for Black people in Brazil, we know that the Brazilian Black movement was key to bring about the change. And when we consider government, we put pressure on the government on different levels of the government, municipal, state, and federal level. Therefore, social movements are highly strategic so that we defend democracy, especially considering the current global scenario. We urgently need to provide funds to social movements so that we can keep moving forward and defending democracy. Soon in 2026, we're going to have presidential elections in Brazil. And we need to do work today so that in the future, for the upcoming Brazilian presidential elections, we're going to have positive results to preserve our democracy. Therefore, it's important that we highlight this. And when we consider strategies for funding for social movements, we need to take into account the macro politics in Brazil. And we know that movements are going to create an alliance throughout Brazil so that we take into account diversity and cater to the needs of organizations. We need to consider political control, social and political control. And basically, we need to train leaders for social movements that are going to shape new ways of doing politics in Brazil. Oftentimes, social movements, they finance themselves. So they join calls for actions, but sometimes they are not registered with the Brazilian authorities. And sometimes activists do all of the work, the activist work, the management work. And when we consider calls to action, most of them They don't cater to the needs to small social movement organizations, but they do the best they can do in spite of those limitations. We know that philanthropy could reach more people and help more social movement organizations if resources were available to people at grassroots level. Here we have a quote, and this is focused on the fact that resources take too long to be available for people, especially to be available for groups that are less institutionalized than other groups that are registered with the Brazilian authorities. And also, there's another factor, which is political will of donors and funding organizations. Therefore, it would be good for organizations, funding organizations, to change their strategy and criteria for granting funds to social movements. And I believe that that would be key so that small social movement organizations would get access to the money. And at the end of the day, red tape and other things like that, they should be removed so that we get the work done. It's important to highlight that. Here we refer to a research that we conducted. Linda Mara is somebody who did the work with us. And when we launched this research last year, we wanted to identify the barriers to access to funding for grassroots organizations in disenfranchised areas in Brazil. Some people were like complaining that financing, the funds were not available. Some people were working overworked. And then we identified, we can see that 32.9% of funding available is through calls to actions. And we have other numbers here, but what I wanted to highlight is the individual actions, which accounts for 23.7% of funds. We did field work. The research was qualitative and quantitative. And people were organizing the work. And when we conducted the individual surveys and the individual forms, some people were like, okay, we got a bread donation from a local bakery. And when we see almost half of the organizations, they get support from their own communities. Therefore, it's important for us to see how the community leaders and the grassroots organizations are conducting self-financing, self-funding. They fund their own activities. And basically, we must tell you that money, philanthropy money, has to be available for people at grassroots level. And here we have more information on private social funding. And we have info on the census on 2022 and 2023. As you can see in red, this is donation from the civil society. And in green, we have other donations of the social movements. And in red, civil society movements. So when we see the data, it's clear, it's plain for us to see that the types of third sector organizations that get money, get funds. But this percentage is high, but we need to observe the type of funds available. 4.9 billion reais were made available for social private investment in Brazil. However, some social organizations, third sector organizations in Brazil, they account for 20% of that amount. So when we consider this amount, we know that there is limited impact for grassroots movements, and what Gelson said is key for us to bear in mind.
We also looked at two categories in support areas that the censorship brings. So we see the culture of peace, defending rights and democracy. And what is important for us to consider here is how much these associations said that they are supporting this agenda primarily. So 99% of those respondents said that their priority is defending rights, culture of peace, and democracy. And 4% said that their priority is institutional development of these organizations and social movements. And so we see that the volume, once again, we know that only 5.2% of the total volume invested was pointed towards defending rights. What would then explain this lack of funding from private social investment to social movements in Brazil? Gelson mentioned some of the points, but we have seen in other moments of this research that we need to express and really define that we are talking about the different political projects of a country that are defended by private social investment and social movements. On the one hand, we see corporate and family philanthropy with a rationale, you know, of a neoliberal market mindset. And on the other hand, we see community and social environmental philanthropy that consider this as part of their participation in fighting for human rights. And so it's important to make this distinction between these two audiences, considering what Jessica Claire studied about philanthropy here in Brazil. And we see how important this is and the barriers that show why this funding is not reaching social movements. And so we see that there's a lack of trust from civil society and in social movements. And this can be seen when we see the constant attacks that organized civil society is facing in our country, or the generalization of the organizations that are defined as corrupt in general because of the corruption scandals that have happened, and end up forgetting everything that these movements have built along the years and along the history of the country. Another point that is seen as a barrier is the formalization as a condition for support. We've talked about this, but the requirement of having a taxpayer number with audits, with different documents, with a different invoicing system, etc. So this is seen as something that will guarantee that that organization will adequately manage the funds. And this ends up creating barriers for them to reach funding, for organizations to be funded. And it's very important that we support the institutionalization of these movements. However, we need to understand that movements will express themselves in different ways. So not necessarily institutionality or this institutional factor will mean that they will be a more influential group or a more effective group in the work that they do. Another group that is another barrier that is seen is the fact that resources are concentrated in formal organizations. So the organizations have to compete with larger NGOs, and they end up being prioritized by social priority movements. Connected to institutionality, we also have measuring impact. Many of the demands of these large funding institutions, they have several demands to measure the impact. And this is also not connected to reality and to the political construction of these movements. And the processes will require long years of struggle so that we can actually see the impact of these initiatives. So the rationale of measuring impact and of measuring success is completely disconnected from the struggle that we see in these organizations. We also have party politics, and this can also be a barrier. So private social investment many times doesn't want to invest in social movements because they believe that this is related to party politics, and this is a lack of knowledge actually, because these movements are very diverse. And so just to say that this social movements only work in the party politics or the defense of a specific party is just wrong. So they need to be supported because they are diverse. And there's also a lack of knowledge about what social movements actually do. And this happens because of the point, for example, that I just mentioned, because of party politics, and also because of other ways of organizing, and to see how they are related to, you know, the way that they are um, um, carrying themselves. And we know that it is important that private institutions get to really know what social movements actually do and what they fight against. So this is a quote from a manager of an independent philanthropy institution, and he says, philanthropy was much more geared towards culture and educational issues in the past, and the human rights agenda was not embraced by traditional philanthropy. Philanthropy was mostly concentrated on social work, supporting important causes, the fight against violences. And this was gradually taken in by philanthropy, and currently some areas of philanthropy still are wary about actually supporting this agenda. However, there is a group of players in community and independent philanthropy that show that there is support to social movements in our country. So here we see some data between community and independent philanthropy funding for social movements, and we can make a connection between this map and the last Census-GIF data. And so this shows that these funding institutions, these donating institutions, they are committed to the fight that these social movements are involved in. And so we see that 71% of the organizations that were mapped said that they are supporting collectives and movements. And it's the same with civil society organizations. 74% said that they are supporting, and we also have individuals as well on that last bar, that last part of the bar chart. And we see that the percentage is of 45% of the support is given to these independent donating institutions. And you will be able to read on our materials the different principles and practices of independent philanthropy in supporting social movements in Brazil. So this is related to acknowledging and valuing the assets of the supported organizations, and also recognizing the autonomy of these organizations. So there needs to be a very specific power rationale, because many times the funding institutions want to impose their own agenda over the social movements because they're donating money. Developing actions to support local and community leaders and other aspects as well. And now to conclude, I believe that the one of the main messages that we want to communicate is that this publication has its political role, and we want it to be supported by philanthropy, by social movements. And as Gelson said, we cannot talk about social transformation without considering the support to these movements. So corporate and family philanthropy, what has it done in this process so far? So for us to invest in new movements, invest in the leaders that are being developed, is considering these alternatives for the future of our country, and those who are actually committed to addressing colonial heritage, racist and sexist heritage that we are still facing in our country, that impact the lives of several Brazilians. So to hear about some of these reflections, I would like to we are going to hear actually about the report itself. Um, and in the end, you will be able to download the report. But now I would like to invite our mediator at our panel, Graciela Hopstein. Yes, we can see you, Graciela. And Graciela has a master's in education and a PhD in social politics. She's a consultant professor and a researcher in the social field. She has authored many papers and books in topics related to public policy, social movements, democracy, and social environmental philanthropy, community development, and assessment. She was the executive director of the Rio Institute and also of Rede Comuá, and she curated content, and she was involved in our research. And currently, she's part of the governing board of Casa Fluminense and Fumbea. So thank you very much for being here, and you have the floor. And thank you so much, Gelson, for having shared with me the presentation of the research. Well, good morning to all. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for this invitation that is related to how much I participated in this research. And we know that we can read the research related to the movement, and this is the topic that Halima is going to talk about. But we need to understand the role of social movements and philanthropy in different contexts. And Valéria, who's part of the PSJP, brought us this proposal, and also Sandrika manifesting how interested she was, and we decided to move forward with the research because it seemed to be extremely relevant in the context that we are in. Um, the far right is advancing, and there is we are moving backwards in some of the public policies related to rights. Therefore, social movements is related to accessing rights and building something that is common, because if we analyze it from a historical standpoint, rights are not given. Rights are, you have to fight for your rights. And so when we talk about universities, same sex marriage, when we talk about agendas related to equal pay for men and women, um, against sexual harassment and against femicide, we are talking about movements. These were the movements that have the ability to transform realities and actually fighting for rights and to avoid for us to go into setbacks. We have the indigenous peoples that are always fighting against the lands that were given to that were there in the past and that they have to continue fighting for them now. And so all of this resistance is the same, but actually power is capturing this resistance. So we need to go into this power struggle where social movements have a very important role.
When we consider the amount of resources that should be available to social movements in Brazil, we know that we need more money to be available. But together with Halima and other people, we put together a special dossier on social movements and philanthropy. And back then, the funding was that only 2% of philanthropy was available to social movements. And I believe that today the reality is even worse than those numbers. And it's shocking. It's high time for us to observe the movements, provide support to social movements, because the agenda on democracy at large is urgent. Of course, there are important things to bear in mind. I too joined other launches, and it's clear that social movements don't receive funds from social private investment because of all of the issues that Jonathas and Gelson shared with us. And there's distrust on social movements. And even if we lived a welfare system in Brazil, that Brazil had inclusive public policies, still philanthropy would play a crucial role in Brazilian society to provide support to social struggle at large, because social struggle, they deliver social change. So taking all of that into account, I would like to start by inviting Halima to join our panel. She's going to be the first person to join. She's an independent researcher. She's been doing work on doing philanthropy in and for Africa. And also she's doing work on social movements. She does work with philanthropic institutions in Brazil, in Africa and globally. And she does work in African institutions, and she's part of PSP, and she's also a member of the editorial council for ICNE, and she has written extensively on philanthropy in Africa and international philanthropy. Halima, welcome to this panel. I'll speak Portuguese, as I told you before, but one of the issues that we would like to understand, we would like you to explain to us, is how this research on for social movements is part of something bigger as regards philanthropy. For instance, you've conducted studies in the African continent. Therefore, it would be good to listen to you. Could you please highlight some parts of the research? And also, you're one of the authors of the research. What are the connections that you observe between Brazil and Africa as regards funding for social movements, and also in a broader context in the global South, and what are the challenges? So please, Halima, try to keep your answer to a 10-minute time. And thank you. We want to listen to you now.
Thank you so much, Graciela, and to Rede Comuá and Jonathas, and the team for inviting me to be here today. And let me just start by saying congratulations. This is just a really, really insightful report, and I think it's going to be of so much value for all of us, especially those of us in the Global South, wanting to learn from what's happening in Brazil. So this has been it's been a long journey. It's part of a much bigger process, but it didn't start off that way, right? When I started thinking about this, really looking at movement experience of philanthropy engagement and perspectives on the nature and role of philanthropy and the relations that they play with movements, it was around 2016, and it was Fees Must Fall, just after, the peak of Fees Must Fall. And what was looking like, every time there was a movement moment in what, the funders term called movement moments, I don't like that term, but funders were talking about, well, what do they do? Shouldn't they get involved? Should they get involved? How should they get involved? And they were having these conversations based on funder assumptions and funder perspectives. And I began really thinking about, well, what does it mean to understand this from a movement perspective? And what does it mean to understand how movements are actually experiencing how philanthropy engages, if it engages, and what's the role that it's playing? And to see this then come into a multi-regional inquiry process is really, really a beautiful thing to watch, and just so wonderful to see. So it started in Africa at a time when movements were making significant transformative inroads, right? And there's the old question of how should they engage? And we began exploring this conversation. I began, CAPSI then got involved. I was on the board management team of PSJP, and we began talking about the space as well. So PSJP then came further into the process, and we really began to think about what are the lessons we can learn? Because PSJP has been really interested in the how of philanthropy and the how change happens. And we're seeing movements and popular organizing as the critical space for where that change happens. And so we used the collective organizing framing to understand this work, but we use movements as a lens, right? So we recognize that social movements are one part of that civic space, but there's much that happens before it. And there's much that happens even between movements and being formalized civil society. So we really wanted to understand what could philanthropy then learn from this collective conversation. And so we had the Africa study. Graciela, you and I and Romy worked on the Alliance publication. We had started at PSJP starting to think about what does a Global South collective conversation look like, and it didn't go very far at that point in time for different reasons. But then Thousand Currents approached us and said that they would like to do a similar study in Asia, and so we began this collaboration between PSJP and Thousand Currents, and then through PSJP conversations, Anna got involved, and then linked to you, Graciela, about how we could think about this conversation in Brazil, but from a contextualized perspective. And so it didn't start off as this deliberate attempt to have these research studies happen in different places of the Global South, but I'm really, really excited that it has come up the way it has, and that we're finally almost closing the circle to say, we're at a point now where we are thinking about what do those Global South collective conversations from movement perspectives look like, especially when it comes to philanthropy. So if I just go back to the start, we've had lots of research on philanthropy, and we've had lots of work on the way philanthropy operates, but we've not really had this from a movement perspective. And so that's been the really, really exciting bit that is bringing us all together. In terms of how the findings resonate, so there, interestingly, there are some differences, but there are also so many similarities, right? So I think really important is the importance of self-resourcing, the different ways in which movements resource themselves through multiple types of giving, not just money, and the role that self-resourcing plays in maintaining movements' agency and control and protection against funder agendas. I think it's completely underestimated, and I do think needs more attention. In Africa, for example, most movements centered their own resourcing as core to their everyday functioning, and the external resourcing then playing complementary roles based on that. And I think we're seeing some similar conversations in Brazil as well. It also, I think, for me, raises a conversation in the philanthropy space about how do we think about activism as a form of philanthropy, and how do we then use it to broaden what we're talking about when we say philanthropy and resourcing. The other thing is that the issue that came out very strongly in Africa, and I see bits of this in the Brazil study as well, is that it wasn't so much about whether philanthropy should be involved. Many of the organizations, there were some exceptions that said they shouldn't, but many of the organizations did not have a problem with philanthropic support, but the how of the philanthropy mattered. So who retains control of decision-making and agenda setting was a critical element in that. But even beyond that, the challenges of bureaucratization, of prioritizing professionalization, about what is measured and how, those are all common elements that come up. Many African movements I spoke to, for example, were not opposed to accountability, but they did have problems with the accountability systems that were being imposed on them, and the ways in which those were depoliticizing the work, the ways in which those would bureaucratizing activism, the ways in which this was turning activists into people who are sitting behind a computer, writing out reports. So, there are a lot of commonalities in terms of the ways in which philanthropy is engaging that I think really we can help to share strategies for mitigating on. There were some differences. So when I started this work, there were not many African spaces supporting movements. This has now increased somewhat. But at that time, majority of the support coming in for African social movements beyond the internal community solidarity resourcing the philanthropic support came from outside the continent. We have a slightly different space now, and we do need to understand that space better, but we don't as yet have a collective voice or collective network for those organizations from the continent that are supporting movements and popular organizing. And I think that we do have the fermentation of that. So there are some spaces for collective funder organizing that has been happening alongside the African social movements Baraza processes through Trust Africa. I'm part of a study commissioned by Trust Africa that's looking at reflecting on the support spaces for social movements and thinking through what's needed to massively increase resourcing. I think in terms of just Global South collective strategizing, there are lots, Global South perspectives, there are many. The registration is very considered practice, and that registration doesn't influence impact is a big thing. I think there's a commonality in terms of instrumentalization of how philanthropy is engaging. So it's about, I'm supporting you because you're advancing a vision or a mission or a project that I'm doing, not supporting you because I'm in solidarity with your agency. I think another challenge is that movements are still not often seen as part of the strategy, but as a separate aside. In some places, this is changing, but not enough. The issue of movements and politics. So again, they're going to struggle to separate partisan politics from movements that have a bigger political agenda, and it's not partisan. I think that there's still not enough attention being paid to local foundations and intermediaries and the ways in which they can work and support movements in much better ways than international philanthropy can. There are lots of challenges around how funding can depoliticize when there isn't enough conversations around how to mitigate this in advance. And I think also around how to engage with movements in ways that meet them where they are, that meet their structures where they are, rather than imposing frameworks and processes and systems that allow us to meet our own donor accountabilities. Lastly, I think just to end, it's that, the space is shifting And sometimes we're seeing a step back, and in other places we're seeing a step forward. But overall, we just need a much more radical, transformative thinking to be able to support movements in the ways that they need and to be able to support what the civic spaces of tomorrow are bringing to us. And I don't think we're there yet. Thank you, Graciela. Oh, back to you.
Thank you, Halima, for this brilliant answer. I think that we have some interesting elements that will contribute greatly to this debate. I would say that there is something very important that you brought, which was talking about this perspective of these movements, not only the philanthropy perspective. So we need to have the perspective of these movements as something key, which means that these movements have ways of self-funding. They know their agendas, they know what they're doing, they know what their demands are. And many times, or most times, as the data shows, they don't need the resources to exist. They will exist not dependent on philanthropy. But the issue is that philanthropy may contribute not as a leading character in this, supporting their role. It's not that philanthropy is bringing its own agenda or bringing its own way of doing it, but it's actually a philanthropy that can support independently, acknowledging their autonomy and acknowledging what their demands are. This is a starting point that is key when we are talking about funding movements, because this is not about philanthropy imposing their agenda or imposing their way of doing things or imposing the activities that they should be doing. Because if the movements think that that their money should be used in being part of a demonstration in Brasilia, that should be done. And so this idea that you're bringing about perspective is extremely important. Movements exist and they will continue existing in spite of philanthropy. However, we can think about how philanthropy can actually contribute to these agendas if they want to be transformative philanthropy or a philanthropy that is considering democracy and a common good. Because if we are not considering this political issue, it won't be, it won't make sense. If philanthropy wants to contribute to these agendas, it needs to respect the autonomy and this way of managing them, self-managing, and the way that the movements are organized and the way that they see themselves, think their strategies. So philanthropy would not be the main character. It would be one of the characters involved, because we know movements need resources. So this is an interesting reflection that you're bringing, the importance of having the perspective of these movements in the center, because these are not these are organizations that don't know red tape, they don't know theories. Many times they don't even know how to create a planning, but they know very well where they want to go, what their agendas are, what they're fighting for, and what they want to achieve in the end. And so this is a very powerful agenda. So thank you so much, Halima. Now I will give the floor to Mariana. Mariana de Paula. I don't know if she's here, Mari. Yes, I'm here. Wonderful, Mari. Welcome. Welcome to this panel. Mariana Di Paula is the co-founder and executive director of the Decodifica Institute. She has a bachelor's in production engineering by Unirio, an MBA in business management by EIEG, and she has a specialization in project management by FGV, and she is doing a graduate course in knowledge management and company intelligence, and she's a researcher at the Decodifica, researching environmental racism and the impact of climate change in, or the climate crisis, sorry, in favelas and peripheral areas of Brazil. So we would like to hear from you, Mariana. You know, maybe you could share with us considering your experience in Decodifica with peripheral movements, what would be the main challenges that they face here in Brazil, and how do you see that national philanthropy actors can actually potentialize the work of these movements? So the idea is for you to talk about the possibilities, this connection between movements and philanthropy in Brazil, specifically considering your experience and your background. So 10 minutes. Good morning to all. It is a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank you for this invitation. And I am going to share about our challenges in accessing these resources from philanthropy. I have a very short presentation for you, just to give you a timeline that will be important for my presentation, and to give us some context. Let me just have it here on presentation mode. And Gracie said that I am representing the Decodifica Institute as an executive director. We were called Lab Jaca until July 2023. We did a rebranding over the past year, and in August this year. And here we're going to share about what the Decodifica Institute is and what we do and what has been our background so far. We are devoted to production, communication, and political incidents based on data focusing on the realities and needs of peripheral areas. We believe data are a powerful tool to transform realities, and that's why we work to collect, analyze, and communicate relevant data, promoting this public debate and providing the agenda for public policies so that we can build public policies that are more inclusive and fair. So we started in the pandemic, and that was our name, Jaca, that you see there. There were some of the insights of where we started. And they talked about the importance of the movement that was done as part of our context, and the Instituto Decodifica started at this time. We started with a campaign called Jaca contra o Corona, or Jaca against the coronavirus, and we created this movement in March 2020. And in this context, just like all other organizations at the time, we were working, giving out food baskets to try to minimize the impacts of COVID in that territory. So we know that most of the peripheral areas in Brazil or favelas, people have informal jobs. So women are leaders in their families. And in that context, in which we had to do social isolation and people had to stay home, these women would not be able to support themselves. So what happened? These people in general, they had to go to work. They were, for example, doormen of buildings, maids, and we saw many cases in which these individuals were not allowed to stay home and get paid. And so the social economical context was very much aggravated during this time and evident in this time. And we were also working considering communication. So there was an increase of 50% in domestic violence against women in the first 3 months of the pandemic. And there was also the WHO saying, how should you wash your hands? How can you be protected against COVID, and all these campaigns? And we have a serious problem related to basic sanitation and water access in these slums and communities. And so we not only wanted to give out these food baskets, but we also wanted to help in communication and communicate to them according to their reality at the Jacarezinho slum where we started. So what did we do? We wanted then to have an idea of which were the families that we were assisting, and to do sort of a census of these families. And we collected the data of that territory, and we had an incidence. Remember, at this time, we didn't have tests, quick nor longer tests. And so we did, it was a, a, a sort of a survey related to the symptoms that the WHO said that were indication for COVID-19. So we would ask those people who we were seeing if they knew people who had those symptoms according to the place where they lived, or if they were experiencing those symptoms. And we realized that 60% of those who responded had those symptoms. And the local newspaper said that there were only 5 confirmed cases of COVID. So this difference between the discrepancy between the data that we saw and the data that was being published by the authorities allowed us to see how effective we could be. And so this is our picture in 2020. We were all very young, and we expanded our work, and we became the Decodifica Institute. But just connecting to our conversation here, how we did fundraising. So we founded JACA Against the Corona in March 2020. We were only using resources that came from different calls for bids. And then in July 2021, we became Lab JACA, an institution. And so for a year, or almost a year and 3 months, we were still working with funding from call for bids, and also in rendering services in specific projects. So in September 2022, we received our first institutional support from International Philanthropy. And in September 2023, we received support from a family office here in Brazil. So from this identity as Labjaca, we became Decodifica, and Decodifica means decoding, so, or cracking the code. So it means that we are maintaining our transformative heart, but we are expanding our work, and we want to connect favelas and create solutions collectively so that this movement can be done collectively and not something that comes from other institutions in something that comes, for example, from the government, and they don't understand our demands. So we want solutions to come from the inside, and we want them to develop these solutions of self-determination and understanding that they know the public policies that are necessary for their movement. And this is our staff now. We have 20 people in it. And I wanted to share this with you and to give you this overview, because we need to understand how challenging it is to find access to resources. When we founded our institution, when we formalized our institute, for a long time, our challenge was, oh, you are not a formal institution, you are not a formal organization. So when we formalized, we founded and created this, they said, oh, but you're a very recent institution. So it took us more than a year to be able to start a bank account, even though we had been an NGO for a long time. And this created many issues for fundraising. The first fundraising that we received from institutional philanthropy, we had to do it through a fiscal sponsor because of the fact that we were a very young company. We weren't able to receive this international resource formally. So after we received this money, we realized that we could have more open doors to receive more funding, not only from companies outside of Brazil, but also here, and this allowed us to work with them. And so in the 5 years that we've been working, the main challenges that we've faced, they ended up changing over time. You know, it seems that once you cross a barrier or you break down a barrier, there's a new barrier in front of you. There's a new door for you to walk through. And this just shows how challenging it is, especially for peripheral organizations and social movements. And Gelson said this: there's so many organizations that are not social, but they have a lot of access to resources. And this is also related to the lack of trust that philanthropy has in us. They think that we won't be able to manage the resources, that we don't understand how to manage those resources. And sometimes this actually happens because we don't know what change theory is. We don't know how to be accountable for our resources. We don't know how to work with spreadsheets, for example, sometimes. And this is not because we are not interested, though, in this topic. It is merely, for example, in our team, we were able, together with the multidisciplinarity of our staff. So, for example, I'm an engineer, we have lawyers on staff, we have journalists. So these are all Black people who came from peripheral areas, from favelas, from poorer areas of Rio, that gathered all their knowledge, founded this organization to try to break this barrier for social movements. But this is not the rule. Unfortunately, this is not so common.
This is the reason why I believe that not acknowledging the fact that we are able to manage the resources, we're able to manage the funds. This is one of the reasons why the organizations sometimes don't provide us with the support we need. And we've been doing work with other organizations throughout Brazil. We've been trying to share knowledge with them, considering that we had issues in organizations from the north of Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, and we provide support to those organizations so that they talk to funders and they learn from our experience. Another challenge we faced was financial stability. For a long time, we received support from, let's say, calls to actions. And in 2022, we got support, institutional support. And, you know, getting support through project-based support, it's quite unsafe for us. And now we can do better work and more consistent work. So this was another knowledge that, a challenge that we still face. Most of the resources that we get, they're project-based funding. And we've been trying to understand what we need to do so that we receive long-term funds, and so that funds, what kind of indicators we should take into account, and how can we make sure that this works for all of us, so that we don't need to adapt our solutions to fit the needs of our donors. And we have multiple donors, right? And we need to do our work, and we need to do long-term work to keep our organization running. And we're getting more mature throughout the process, but still a challenge. And also bureaucracy when we consider getting access to funds and unequal access to funds. You know, institutionalization, the complex strategies for accountability. I'm not only talking about the compliance and accountability. And you know, all of the research, we need to have difficult conversations, And it's important that philanthropy is willing to support us the way we actually need, and how we can make this conversation more flexible, so that the procedures, the accountability procedures, are conducted in a way that the people at grassroots level can actually do it. And plenty organizations doing work on human rights and Instituto Codifica, and the work, and we see that environmental activists have their work threatened when they deal with other things, when we consider public security, when we approach things in different ways. And it's important that philanthropy takes into account our challenges so that we have a more flexible conversation, so that funds are available at grassroots level. And at the same time, we need to cater to the needs of philanthropy so that we can move on and doing work together, so that together as an ecosystem, we can face the social challenges in Brazil. Thank you so much, Mari. Such a good answer. And what you just said, you shared ideas that connect with what Halima shared with us. I'm going to highlight two things. First of all, is the power of social movements as regards self-management and self-affirmation, and also producing knowledge and producing communication. Social movements have strategies for their own struggle. Therefore, communication is one important pillar in your strategy, in your struggle. The knowledge production that Codifica does, it shows the perspective of knowledge, not the academic and white and bourgeois knowledge, but it's knowledge that is shaped by people from disenfranchised communities for people from disenfranchised communities. And this is really aligned to the perspective of movements, providing movements with their own voice. And it shows the capacity of transformation, the capacity for struggle, endurance, and organizing. And another thing that you highlighted, especially at the end, and it's something that I'll approach before passing it on to Valéria. And another thing that Halima said, that sometimes we face hurdles, and those hurdles are political hurdles. They're not technical hurdles. When we consider, Max Weber used to approach this. He said that red tape is a machine, a power machine to limit people. That basically, red tape is a way for philanthropy to exert its own power. So fighting red tape, fighting bureaucracy, and being aware that it exists, it's political action, because it's not a practical, technocratical action. Technocracy is really connected to politics. Therefore, the hurdles that we've been talking about are political hurdles, because somehow power uses those strategies to put a halt to the power of movements. Thank you so much, Mari. We'll soon have a second round of questions, and you'll be able to talk again. Now I'll pass it on to Valéria. Valéria has been an important person in this research. She has done work in PJPD, and also did work in partnership with Rede Comuá. All of you know Valéria. She's the director executive of Fundo Brasil de Direitos Humanos. She's a lawyer. She has an specialization in indigenous rights. She's the founder of ISA Social and Environmental, and she was the executive director from Range Flower Foundation in New York. Anna, welcome. Welcome to our debate. And we believe that it's going to be wonderful to listen from you. And I would like you to approach here perspectives on funding and mechanisms to funding for independent organizations. We know that the philanthropy scenario for social movements is challenging. However, there are successful experiences in Brazil that we could approach: community philanthropy and other movements. One example is Fundo Brasil work to provide support to Black movements, women movements, indigenous movements, and human rights movements at large in Brazil. So my question for you is, how can donor institutions from autonomous community philanthropy can support the struggle for rights in Brazil and also support social movements in Brazil? So how the experience of those organizations can help inspire change in traditional philanthropy in Brazil? So basically, there are two questions, and feel free to reply to them the best way possible. Thank you, Graciela. Good morning, all. It's such a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Rede Comuá for inviting me to join this panel, and it's such an honor and privilege to join all of you. It's so good to connect with Halima again and connect with Graciela as well. I too would like to congratulate Rede Comuá and the researchers that conducted this research. And this research is a powerful instrument. And also to congratulate PSPD. And Halima is representing the institution. And this institution is such an inspiration for us to reflect upon how social movements work and how funding for social movements work, and how can philanthropy learn from this. And this is part of the work that was being performed by PSJP. And having a research in Africa and another one focused in Asia and now another one focused in Brazil, and be able to reflect upon those results, it shows that the outcomes that we get are positive. I'll try to be brief. And I would like to start by talking about Fundo Brasil. We are an independent organization, and as other organizations that are part of Rede Comuá, we provide support to civil society organizations and social movements at large. Therefore, Rede Comuá has institutions such as Fundo Brasil, and also theme funds that are really focused on racial equity or the LGBT population. And all of us are focused on grant making. That means we donate financial resources and also non-financial resources to different groups, grassroots organizations, networks, activists, and social movements at large. All of us are focused on acknowledging the need to protect human rights and humanitarian development and sustainability at large. the main pillar of the way we do philanthropy here in Brazil, considering Fundo Brazil and Rede Comuá, is focused on trust building. All of us were saying how key that is so that we can provide support to social movements. Social movements, they are at the forefront to get the work done. And as Graciela said, the donations we do, they're politically motivated. And basically, we want to take into account public goods, creating and implementing regulations and rules so that we can take care of the shared life we live in society. Therefore, we focus on grant making, non-intervention grant making. Basically, we're going to provide funds for organizations, for our grantees, and we're going to trust that they're the ones who are going to be in charge of their own struggle, considering that they're the groups that are at the forefront and are affected by human rights violations. They are the ones who can come up with the solutions, and they should be the ones in charge of implementing the solutions. Therefore, we as philanthropy providing support to those groups, we understand that their knowledge and their strategy are key. And we want to build philanthropy to foster production of rights, the exercise of rights that takes into account their own possibilities. When we consider Fundo Brasil, we do work with different types of organizations, the Black movement organizations, disenfranchised communities fighting police violence. And here in Brazil, the police violence is targeted at Black people at large. We provide support to the prison population. And we also know that most people in prison in Brazil are Black people. And we do this struggle as regards original peoples and indigenous people for their rights to the land and access to social resources, and also the struggle for social justice that caters to the needs of the originary peoples. We also consider reproductive rights, women's rights, the fights against gender-based violence, and we also consider the queer population, and also grassroots movements fighting for decent labor and fair labor. And they are facing issues that regards precarious work. And all of what we do, intersectionality is paramount. So whenever we provide funds, we consider intersectionality. We consider gender, race, and territory, because all of those factors, they should be at the center of what we do and what's necessary for us to provide support to.
So it is in this sense that the Fundo Brasil and the other organizations that are in the Comuá network and that are doing this different philanthropy, they are strategic actors because of everything we heard about today, because we are promoting agendas that are connected to community philanthropy with environmental justice. We have a way of making these resources get to the most remote areas of the country, supporting grassroots organizations, especially those who focus on the institutional development. Mariana talked about this importance of making this institutional support so that these supported organizations can put these resources in the areas that they need so that they can move forward. Fundo Brasil and other organizations have technology transfer and mutual learning. For example, one of the works that we've been doing with CONAC, the organization related to former slave communities, we have been working with technology transfer so that in few time they can administer or manage this Quilombola fund. And so how can they manage this fund? This is part of our experience methodology. So this is a technology that we've been trying to transfer to social movements. We have worked with indigenous movements. We are working with the Quilombola, these former slave communities, and we also do all of this so that they can manage their own funds, their territorial funds in the country. I believe that it is also important to say that moving beyond institutional support, we also work strengthening incidents, mobilization, articulation. We also work to respond to emergencies in a very fast manner. And we can do all of this renewing and adjusting the funding mechanisms so that they can be in dialogue or connected to civil society and social movements, promoting solutions that can be seen or that can be scalable so that they can respond to the great challenges as we are seeing now with climate change. And when Graciela asked, how these institutions can actually inspire transformation, well, I believe that this is related to a set of experiences that can inspire or that can help traditional or conventional philanthropy as a whole. And also providing the possibility of building strategies in partnership or in collaboration. So building trust, providing resources with capillarity, providing support to regional diversity, which makes a difference here in Brazil. And our ability to democratize access to resources, working with funding mechanisms that are more simplified and that are very efficient, making philanthropy, something that will be less, that will have less bureaucracy, so that we can get the resources to the most remote regions, as I said, because our mechanisms and all the red tape exists, but we are able to reduce them so that we can actually allow all groups to receive access. We are able to support, we have supported these groups that are not formal, that are not institutionalized, and there are several ways of doing this legally within the ways that we can do this, considering funding institutions, but also finding other ways of being able to remove all these obstacles so that the money can actually get to where it needs to get. And I believe that I would just like to answer to some of the aspects that were mentioned here before. Gelson said that the money apparently is getting to where it needs, or actually the money's getting to the destination that those who are sending want. And I agree with you when we talk about social justice philanthropy. That is done by funds and organizations that are in the Rede Comuá context. And we know that there's this lack of formalization, this ignorance on how the social movements work, how they can measure impact. But all of these issues we also face, but the difference is in the intentionality. Fundo Brasil was created to promote human rights, and to promote human rights in this country, we believe that we need to support grassroots organizations, social movements, because they are the ones who are doing true transformation. So when we get into discussions with philanthropy organizations, all of the organizations that we know nowadays, they say that they want to support social transformation, and we are in a country that needs social transformation. However, for social transformation to happen, we will need to make room for people in communities who have been excluded. We need to get out of our comfort zone. We're going to have to lose our privileges. So we have to be intentional. You need to actually want to do it. You can't just say, oh, we are doing social transformation, we are doing this or that in a peaceful, quiet way. No, for social transformation to actually happen in this country, as a whole, we need to be able to empower those players who are actually making a difference and who are making change happen and who are allowing for the rights agenda to move forward in our country. Rights are not granted. We fight for the rights that we need. And that's exactly it. So, if we want a better country, if we effectively want to transform our country, we need to support transformation, supporting social movements, and being able to step away from this transformation narrative and actually have the intention of supporting the actors who are able to do that. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Anna, for bringing these aspects that are so strategic. Um, as I was listening to you, you talked about trust, you talk about autonomy, accessing resources, which are the principles that guide independent philanthropy. And I was thinking that this requires a new political pact, right? We need to acknowledge the power that these movements have. And I would say that this requires understanding institutional strengthening, not only, as I said, as a technocratical aspect. Institutional strengthening is strengthening these movements politically. So that's why this aspect has political costs, because it's not easy, as you said. It requires having to deal with several different issues that we need to mention here. And we need to understand that movements are always being violated in their rights, they are always being threatened, and they have health issues, their activists have health issues. So we are talking about a topic that is extremely complex. But um, I think it's interesting for you to mention all of these issues and the importance of transferring methodologies, considering collaboration strategies, which is what Fundo Brazil is doing right now. So, how can you help other funds to support movements? Because your work is not only about supporting movements, but actually supporting the infrastructure of the sector that is supporting the movements. So, here, those of us who are here, we are at a very interesting moment to consider all of these agendas and how we can actually create mechanisms that will allow us to consider the support or the way that we should support movements in a more political way and with priority. So now we are moving on to the last moment of our time together. We have two questions in the Q&A function, but I would like to end with a final round from our speakers. I have two questions, one to Halima and one to Mariana, but you can answer whichever and also give us your final remarks. No questions were posed to you, Anna, but we would like to hear from you in about 5 minutes for us to close the panel. So for Halima, maybe we can start in this order. The question is, in which African countries have you worked? Because we believe that it's hard to compare all of Africa, all of the African continent to Brazil when we talk about philanthropy. And I'm going to ask also Mariana the question that was posed to her. So the question is more of a practical standpoint. So Mariana, when did you feel that you could hire people? So Vinicius is asking this question because he's trying to create an institute with his friends with a purpose that is similar to Decodifica, and they feel that the challenge is actually, hiring people to create the institute and allowing them to pay for employees. So these are the labor costs or operational costs that are related to the payment of employees. These are the two questions. The first one will be posed to Halima, and I will give you 5 minutes, and then I will give the floor to Mari and then to Ana Valéria for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Graciela. So to start off with, when I did this research, I started off by saying that generalizations are impossible. And what this research just sought to do was to lift up issues that were being identified by movements and to try to get some broad spectrum of responses from across the continent. So it started with 8 African countries, and then we added several more from West Africa after. And again, what they did was, so recognizing context is important. What they did tell us was that the ways in which international philanthropy was engaging, I'm sorry, it's just asking me to switch my translation so that they can get the translation properly. I hope that that's okay. So while generalizations are very, very difficult, what it did tell us were the ways in which international philanthropy was engaging with social movements across many different African countries were raising some of the same issues. So it's not that the context in African countries were the same, but the ways in which the philanthropy was engaging was raising a lot of commonalities in terms of the challenges that they were facing. And we're seeing some of those commonalities. Again, the same issue was in Asia, where, Asia is such a broad space, but we're seeing some commonalities coming up. And so what we really wanted to do with this work was to use the research and the findings to surface the conversations about what are some of the problematic issues and to actually help to engage in conversations, in knowledge building, in dialogues, in work with social movements that helped philanthropy to better understand this. So help philanthropy to explore some of those issues, to figure out what are the other ones that we've missed, what are the ones that are not so highlighted. And so it's an important conversation to have. How this cannot talk for all of Africa, I certainly cannot. But these are some of the commonalities that are coming up. And to better understand these spaces in country, in context, really needs much more dedicated, direct attention, even within a specific country, depending on what kind of a movement is. A climate justice movement may have a different kind of relationship than a pro-democracy movement, or a movement that actually is taking a partisan political stance because they're fighting an autocratic leadership. So I think even within countries, there are differences in relationships, and I think that's important to mention. I mean, my final parting words, I think, is just that there's so much to learn from Ana, Valéria, and some of the independent funders in Brazil that are doing this work and doing it and connecting in different ways. And I think that there's real opportunities to advance more global South learning for all of us collectively. And I hope that we can find ways to be able to take that agenda forward. Thank you.
Vinicius, our team has grown, but it happened last year. But I included, I just quit the other job I had, and now I'm working full time at Decodifica. You know, I started working in February this year, so it's quite recent. So it's long term and it takes time. We need to do it little by little. And what we did in Codifica was that we wanted to prioritize certain people. For people who had no jobs, we wanted them to work full time with us. And the strategy that we used was to create this safety step by step. Now all of us are working full time and we face financial challenges to this day. We don't allocate people linked to projects. We want to keep people within the organization. And at the same time, we're doing our best to put together our financial stabilization. We're a team of 20 people. And this is the kind of thing that we must bear in mind each and every day. And we manage resources. We need to balance the cash flow. And also we need to come up with other ways of getting funds. We still apply to calls to action. Sometimes we provide services to get paid. We don't have a single answer to your question, but this is the way we've been working over the last 5 years, and basically keep on doing the work and think about key people to stay in the organization for you to fund the institution, and how much you can pay to those people so that they keep on working and they keep getting more resources, and for them to do the work and work at the organization. That's my message. And should I deliver the last message or not? So my final remarks, considering Vinicius' question, who is trying to found an organization. And I usually tell people that, unfortunately, in Brazil, we face so many problems that there is room for work for different social movements everywhere in Brazil. And since we're doing work in disenfranchised communities, in those places, we need to get the work done there. And it's important that philanthropy bears that in mind and doesn't assess our capacity of doing work. And we can do work for coalitions and other institutions. I hope we can move forward in this debate to create networks of collaboration and being transparent, and both to philanthropy and also social movements. We're going to share about our challenges, what kind of resources and tools we can resort to so that we can get the work done, but also to bear in mind the challenges that we as philanthropy, as organizations face, because we are grassroots organizations and our work is a huge challenge already. And that means that we as social civil society organized institutions, we need to keep on doing the work, and we carry this sense of community. We want to tackle the problems that haunt our communities. And I hope that philanthropy is exercised as a right and respectful to social organizations. Thank you, Mari. Now let's listen to Anna's final remarks. Thank you, Graciela. I would like to repeat certain things that have been mentioned before. And, it's important for us to support social movements. And we need to strengthen and acknowledge the autonomy of organizations and social movements. And by doing so, we acknowledge the role that communities and territories play when deciding the way we can do the work. And not only as regards managing resources, but also power at large. We need to acknowledge the autonomy of those movements so that they can get the work done. We can't provide support to social movements without acknowledging their autonomy. Therefore, it means that we need to conduct philanthropy as providing support for people. And we need to keep on doing the work. We shouldn't force people to follow our way of doing work. And basically, we need to build with philanthropy. And what I mean by that is that community philanthropy and social justice, they show collective intelligence, the debate, and how much people actually trust social change. And those independent organizations that joined Rede, Comuá, they're not intermediaries. They also deliver solutions. And basically, they are part of a very complex dynamics that connect to Brazil. And it's enriched by listening to our partners and by all of the relationship that we have with grassroots movements. Listening to grassroots movements, it changes our strategies so that we shape strategies that cater to the needs of social movements. When we consider Fundo Brazil, we have governance instances, we have representatives from rural movements, and they join our strategy at all levels. Not only do we listen to grassroots movements, but we also include representatives of those movements in our decision making. And we try to do what grassroots movements need us to do. And when we consider social environmental things, we provide support in a way that we can shape other possible futures so that civil society organizations can actually play the lead role. And Graciela talked about political pacts, and it's true. Political pacts, they have a political cost, and that means that we need to abandon our comfort zone and build a better world for all. And considering that this is something that we have to do because the current scenario is not good for nobody whatsoever. So if we want to do things in a different way, we need to come up with a way to get it done. Therefore, philanthropy funds, community philanthropy funds, and other organizations at Rede Comuá. They're highly experienced on seeing how change has been delivered. And here we are ready to collaborate, to establish partnerships. And we need to keep on discussing so that we can deliver change at large. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Anna. Thank you once again to all panel members. We're quite punctual and we're bound to finish this panel. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Graciela, not only for being our mediator, but also for playing such an important role, especially when shaping and organizing this research. Thank you, Ana Valéria, Halima, Mari. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time and sharing your reflections. And I'm just going to share the screen with the link so that you can have access to the text of the research. You can have access through the QR code. You can also click the link available at our chat. And I hope that next year we'll host other opportunities for us to discuss and exchange ideas. And our struggle lives on and we depend on each other. And providing support to social movements is key for us to strengthen the movements so that they can keep on challenging philanthropy to rethink their practices so that the communities and territories that are delivering social change are considered in a different way. I'm sharing a survey on this event, so please answer. And thank you so much for joining us. We know that everybody's super busy in December, but thank you for joining us. Thank you, Comuá team, for providing all of the support so that we could host this webinar. Thank you so much to the interpreters, Rane and Denise. And it's so important that we can share solidarity and we can overcome linguistic issues. Thank you so much. We'll have this event available at Rede Comuá channels soon. Thank you and have a lovely end of the week. Have a lovely weekend.